May 14th, 1945, 40 miles off the coast of Delaware. The Atlantic Ocean rolled in long, gray swells beneath a colorless sky. On the surface, nothing stirred except the wheeling gulls and the distant silhouette of a Coast Guard cutter on patrol. But below, in the crushing darkness, 300 feet down, something ancient and terrible was rising. U-85. 8 broke the surface like a breaching whale, her conning tower splitting the water first, streaming brine from every rivet. Salt water cascaded off her wet steel hull as she stabilized, wallowing in the waves. On her deck, no guns swung toward the horizon, no lookout scanned for targets. Instead, a makeshift flag, fashioned from bed sheets and whatever black cloth the crew could find, rose slowly up the periscope mast. It was not the flag of the Kriegsmarine. It was not the swastika banner of the Third Reich. It was a flag of surrender, hoisted by men who had just learned that the war they had been fighting was already over. The crew emerged from the hatches, blinking in the unfamiliar daylight, pale as ghosts after weeks in the submarine's artificial twilight. They stood on the deck in silence, hands raised, watching as American warships closed in around them. For these men, the war had ended not with a bang, but with a transmission crackling through the radio room days earlier, informing them that Germany had capitulated. They had been hunting off the American coast when peace arrived. Now they were the hunted, surfacing into a world that had moved on without them. This was the strange epilogue to the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest and most savage maritime campaign of the Second World War. For nearly 6 years, German U-boats had prowled the ocean depths, sinking millions of tons of Allied shipping and claiming the lives of tens of thousands of merchant seamen. They were the wolves of the sea, silent predators operating in packs, strangling Britain's supply lines and threatening to starve an entire nation into submission. At the height of their effectiveness in 1942 and early 1943, U-boats were sending Allied ships to the bottom faster than they could be replaced. Winston Churchill would later write that the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. But by the spring of 1945, the hunters had become the hunted. Allied technological superiority, code-breaking triumphs, and overwhelming naval and air power had turned the Atlantic into a graveyard for German submariners. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in the U-boat force during the war, nearly 30,000 would never return home. It was among the highest casualty rates of any military service in any nation during the entire conflict. The sleek gray submarines that had once been instruments of terror were now floating coffins, their crews sent out on missions that increasingly resembled suicide runs. Yet even as the Reich crumbled, even as Soviet tanks rolled through Berlin and American troops crossed the Elbe, U-boats remained at sea. Some crews had departed on patrol weeks or even months before the final collapse. Others had sailed in the war's dying days, knowing the situation was hopeless, but following orders nonetheless. They operated in an information vacuum, dependent on sporadic radio transmissions that could be days old by the time they were decoded. The ocean was vast, communication was unreliable, and for many of these submarines, the end of the war arrived not as a thunderous announcement, but as a whispered rumor filtering through the static. The story of these final U-boats begins not with their surrender, but with their deployment. In the winter and early spring of 1945, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the Kriegsmarine and Hitler's eventual successor, continued to send submarines into the Atlantic even as Germany's cities burned and her armies disintegrated. It was partly strategic calculation. Every Allied ship sunk was one fewer vessel that could support the invasion of the homeland. But it was also a matter of institutional momentum, the grim inertia of a military machine that could not easily be stopped even when defeat was certain. Then on May 4th, the radio room intercepted a transmission. Admiral Dönitz had issued an order to all U-boats. Cease offensive operations immediately. Do not attack Allied vessels. The message was stunning in its implications, though it stopped short of announcing surrender. For the crew of U-858, operating thousands of miles from home in waters patrolled by enemy forces, the directive raised more questions than it answered. Was this the beginning of a ceasefire? Had Germany negotiated peace terms? Or was this simply the end? The answer came days later. On May 8, 1945, Germany signed the Instrument of Unconditional Surrender. In Europe, the guns fell silent. In Berlin, Soviet soldiers raised the red flag over the Reichstag. In London, crowds thronged the streets in jubilation. But aboard U-858, there was only stunned silence. Kapitän Lieutenant Bode gathered his crew and informed them that the war was over, that Germany had been defeated, and that they were now to follow Admiral Donitz's final instructions. Surface: raise a black or white flag of surrender, proceed on the surface to the nearest Allied port, and give themselves up. The crew's reaction was mixed. Some felt relief that they would survive, that they would not become another statistic in the U-boat service's horrific death toll. Others felt shame, anger, or disbelief. They had been trained to be warriors, to fight to the last breath, and now they were being ordered to surrender without firing a shot. Still others simply felt numb, exhausted by months at sea and the cumulative weight of a lost war. But whatever their feelings, they had little choice. To continue operating would make them pirates. To return to Germany was impossible. There was no Germany to return to, at least not one that could shelter or resupply them. Surrender was the only option. On May 10th, Bode transmitted his position and intentions to Allied authorities. On May 14th, U-858 surfaced off Delaware and was met by ships of the United States Navy. American sailors boarded the submarine, taking custody of the crew in the vessel. The German submariners were treated correctly, even courteously, though the experience was deeply humiliating. They had been the elite of the Kriegsmarine, volunteers who had undergone rigorous training and who had been told they were fighting for the survival of their nation. Now they stood on the deck of their submarine with their hands up, prisoners of a war that had ended before they even knew it was over. U-858 was not alone in her strange fate. Across the Atlantic, other U-boats were experiencing similar awakenings. U-889, a Type 9 C-40 submarine that had departed Germany in April 1945, never conducted a single combat operation. Her mission had been to lay mines off the coast of North America, but by the time she reached her patrol area, the war had ended. On May 10th, after receiving the surrender orders, U-889 surfaced south of Newfoundland, flying a black flag. The Canadian Navy dispatched warships to intercept her, and on May 13th, the submarine was formally taken into custody at Shelburne, Nova Scotia. Her commander, Kapitän Lieutenant Friedrich Breuker, surrendered his vessel and his crew without incident. The surrender of U-889 to Canadian forces was notable, not just for its timing, but for what it represented. Canada had played a crucial role in the Battle of the Atlantic, providing convoy escorts and anti-submarine patrols that helped turn the tide against the U-boats. For Canadian sailors who had spent years fighting the submarine menace, the sight of a German U-boat surfacing peacefully and surrendering was both gratifying and surreal. This was not the dramatic confrontation they had trained for, but rather an anticlimax, a whimper rather than a bang. Further north, in the frigid waters near Iceland and Norway, other U-boats were making their own decisions. Some commanders, facing the prospect of surrender, chose instead to scuttle their vessels. This was in keeping with the spirit of Operation Regenbogen, a contingency plan developed by Admiral Dönitz that called for the destruction of German ships to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. The scuttling orders were never fully implemented. Dönitz himself countermanded them at the last moment, fearing reprisals against German prisoners of war. But some U-boat commanders, either unaware of the change or unwilling to surrender, went ahead and sank their own submarines. U-534, operating in the Kattegat Strait between Denmark and Sweden, was one such boat. On May 5th, after receiving confused and contradictory orders, her commander decided to head for Norway rather than return to Germany. But British aircraft located the submarine and attacked, forcing her to dive. Damaged and leaking, U-534 eventually surfaced, and her crew abandoned ship before she sank in shallow water. The submarine remained on the seafloor for decades, a time capsule of the war's final hours, before being raised in 1993. Inside, investigators found evidence of the crew's final moments: personal belongings, documents, even the remains of meals left unfinished. Not all scuttlings were the result of enemy action. Some U-boat commanders, particularly those operating in distant waters, made the deliberate choice to sink their vessels rather than surrender them. This was often motivated by a mix of pride, defiance, and a desire to prevent the Allies from studying German technology. The Type 21 submarine, known as the Electroboot, was a revolutionary design featuring streamlined hulls, increased battery capacity, and the ability to remain submerged for extended periods. It represented a quantum leap in submarine technology, and several Type 21 boats were scuttled by their crews to keep them out of Allied hands. Others were captured intact and subsequently influenced post-war submarine development in both the United States and the Soviet Union. But for most U-boats, scuttling was not an option. By May 1945, the majority of the remaining submarines were either in port or within easy reach of Allied forces. Admiral Dönitz's surrender orders were clear. Boats at sea were to surface and make for Allied ports, while boats in German-controlled harbors were to remain in place and await Allied occupation. The plan was orderly, methodical, designed to prevent chaos and ensure the safety of the crews. What it could not prevent was the emotional and psychological toll on the men who had to carry it out. The surrender process unfolded across multiple theaters. In the Baltic, U-boats crowded into ports like Kiel, Flensburg, and Wilhelmshaven, where they were boarded by British forces. In Norway, which had been occupied by Germany throughout the war, dozens of U-boats were stationed in bases along the coast. These vessels surrendered to British and Norwegian authorities in the days following Germany's capitulation. In France, at bases like Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, U-boats that had spent the war operating out of concrete-reinforced bunkers now floated idle, their crews under Allied guard. The logistics of handling so many surrendered submarines were staggering. By the end of May 1945, over 150 U-boats had surrendered or been captured. Each vessel had to be searched, cataloged, and secured. Crews had to be disarmed, interrogated, and processed as prisoners of war. The submarines themselves represented a treasure trove of intelligence, from codebooks and equipment to details about tactics and technology. Allied naval officers descended on the captured U-boats like archaeologists exploring ancient tombs, documenting every aspect of the vessels in exhaustive detail. For the German submariners, the transition from warriors to prisoners was jarring. Many had spent years at sea, living in the confined spaces of a U-boat, bonded by shared hardship and danger. Now they found themselves in prisoner of war camps, separated from their comrades, their purpose erased, their nation defeated. Some adapted quickly, grateful to have survived. Others struggled with depression, guilt, and a sense of betrayal. They had been told they were fighting for Germany's survival, and now Germany had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. The treatment of surrendered U-boat crews varied depending on where they fell into Allied hands. British authorities, who had borne the brunt of the U-boat campaign for years, were generally correct but stern. American authorities, particularly those dealing with submarines that surrendered off the U.S. coast, were often more lenient, viewing the German sailors as defeated enemies rather than war criminals. Canadian forces, who had also suffered heavily in the Atlantic, adopted a pragmatic approach, processing crews efficiently and without unnecessary harshness. There were, however, exceptions. Some U-boat commanders and crew members were suspected of war crimes, particularly in cases where submarines had fired upon survivors of sunken ships or had otherwise violated the rules of naval warfare. These individuals were segregated and subjected to more intensive interrogation. A few were eventually prosecuted, though the majority of U-boat personnel were not charged with criminal offenses. The general view among the Allies was that the U-boat crews had been following orders in a brutal war, and that holding individual submariners accountable for the broader campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare would be impractical and potentially unjust. One of the most poignant aspects of the U-boat surrenders was the realization, among both captors and captives, that many of the submarines had been at sea when the war ended. These crews had continued their patrols in good faith, unaware that their nation had collapsed. When U-858 surfaced off Delaware, her crew genuinely believed they were still at war until the final radio transmission confirmed otherwise. When U-889 received the surrender order, her commander initially suspected it might be an Allied trick, a ruse designed to lure German submarines to the surface where they could be destroyed. It took multiple confirmations before he accepted that the message was genuine. This information lag, a product of the limitations of naval communication in the 1940s, meant that the war's end was experienced differently by different crews. For those in port when the surrender came, it was immediate and undeniable. For those at sea, it was gradual, filtered through static and secondhand reports, a slow dawning rather than a sudden revelation. Some submarines surfaced days after Germany's capitulation, their crews emerging into a world that had moved on without them. Others took even longer, delayed by storms, damaged equipment, or simply the vast distances involved. The psychological impact of this delayed ending cannot be overstated. Imagine spending weeks in the claustrophobic confines of a submarine, operating under the assumption that you are still at war, still a threat, still relevant. Then imagine surfacing to discover that everything you were fighting for has already ended, that your mission is meaningless, that history has already been written and you are merely a footnote. For many U-boat crews, this was the reality of May 1945. They had been operating in a vacuum, cut off from the flow of events, and when they finally rejoined the world, they found themselves obsolete. The fate of the surrendered U-boats themselves was equally anticlimactic. In the months following the war, the Allies debated what to do with the captured submarines. Some argued for preserving them as museum pieces or using them for testing and evaluation. Others favored immediate destruction, viewing the U-boats as symbols of German aggression that should be erased. In the end, most of the surrendered submarines were sunk in a massive operation known as Operation Deadlight. Between November 1945 and February 1946, 116 U-boats were towed out into the Atlantic and scuttled in deep water north of Ireland. It was a spectacular and melancholy end for vessels that had once been among the most feared weapons of war. They were sunk by gunfire, torpedoes, and demolition charges, slipping beneath the waves one by one until the ocean reclaimed them. The operation was partly practical. There was no need for so many submarines in peacetime, and maintaining them would have been expensive. But it was also symbolic, a deliberate act of erasure designed to close the chapter on the U-boat war. A handful of U-boats escaped this fate. The United States retained several for evaluation, including U-505, which had been captured in 1944 and is now a museum exhibit in Chicago. The Soviet Union received several submarines as part of war reparations and used them to inform their own submarine development. France and Britain also kept a few boats for testing, but the vast majority ended up on the bottom of the Atlantic, entombed in the same waters where they had once hunted. For the men who had crewed these submarines, the post-war years were a time of adjustment and reflection. Many struggled to reintegrate into civilian life, haunted by memories of the war and the comrades they had lost. The U-boat service had been a close-knit community, bound by shared danger and a sense of elite status, and the abrupt end of that world left many veterans adrift. Some remained silent about their experiences, unwilling or unable to discuss what they had endured. Others, particularly in later years, began to speak more openly, contributing to a growing body of literature and oral history about the U-boat campaign. The surrenders of May 1945 also raised questions about the nature of warfare and the treatment of defeated enemies. The U-boat crews had fought in a campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking civilian ships and causing massive loss of life among merchant seamen. Yet they were treated as prisoners of war rather than criminals, reflecting a broader Allied decision to distinguish between following orders in wartime and committing atrocities. This distinction was not always clear-cut, and debates about the morality and legality of submarine warfare continue to this day. In the decades since the war, the story of the surrendered U-boats has taken on a mythic quality. It represents the end of an era, the final chapter of a campaign that reshaped naval warfare and left an indelible mark on history. The image of a German submarine surfacing to surrender, her crew emerging into the daylight with hands raised, encapsulates the tragedy and futility of war. These men had been trained to be hunters, to strike from the depths and vanish without a trace. Instead, they found themselves exposed, vulnerable, their purpose stripped away, their war over before they even realized it. The legacy of the U-boat campaign is complex and contested. On one hand, the submarines came perilously close to achieving their strategic objective of severing Britain's supply lines. Had they succeeded, the outcome of the war might have been very different. On the other hand, the U-boat offensive ultimately failed, defeated by a combination of Allied technology, intelligence, and sheer industrial capacity. The cost was staggering on both sides. The U-boats sank approximately 3,000 Allied merchant ships and killed more than 70,000 Allied seamen. In return, the Allies destroyed nearly 800 U-boats and killed 30,000 German submariners. These numbers are more than statistics. They represent lives cut short, families shattered, futures erased. They represent the young men who volunteered for the U-boat service out of patriotism, adventure, or simply a desire to serve, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare of claustrophobic terror and sudden death. They represent the merchant seamen who went down with their ships, the convoy escorts who hunted the U-boats across the Atlantic, and the countless others whose lives were touched by the longest battle of the Second World War. When U-858 surfaced off Delaware on that gray May morning, she was more than just a submarine surrendering to superior force. She was a symbol of an entire campaign reaching its conclusion, of a weapon that had once seemed invincible being rendered obsolete, of men who had believed they were fighting for something greater than themselves, discovering that their sacrifice had been for nothing. The crew stood on the deck, blinking in the unfamiliar daylight, watching as American warships closed in. They had left Germany months earlier, full of purpose and determination. Now they were returning, not as conquerors or even as warriors, but as the defeated remnants of a war already consigned to history. The waters off Delaware where U-858 surrendered are calm today, traversed by cargo ships and pleasure craft that owe their safe passage to the fact that the U-boat threat no longer exists. The submarine herself was taken to the United States, studied extensively, and eventually sunk as a target vessel. Her crew was interned, interrogated, and eventually repatriated to a Germany that had been divided and occupied. Captain Lieutenant Bode returned to civilian life, rarely speaking of his service. The story of his surrender, like so many stories from the war's end, faded into obscurity, remembered only by naval historians and those with a particular interest in the final days of the Third Reich. But the image endures, a submarine rising from the depths, her hull slick with seawater, a makeshift flag of surrender fluttering from her mast. Men emerging from below, pale and exhausted, stepping into a world that has moved on without them. It is an image of endings, of the strange and often absurd ways that wars conclude, of the disconnect between individual experience and historical inevitability. For the crew of U-858, for the crew of U-889, and for all the other U-boat crews who surfaced in May 1945 to discover that the war was already over, it was the final chapter of a story that had no victors, only survivors. The Battle of the Atlantic was over. The U-boats were silent, and beneath the waves in the cold darkness where they had once prowled, the ocean kept its secrets, indifferent to the struggles of men, indifferent to victory and defeat, eternal and unchanging as the generations who fought and died upon its surface passed into memory.